It's been an interesting first year of the Biden administration, and I think it's worth kind of looking at with a sort of big picture mentality of what's going on. Because, Adolf Reed once wrote that what I think is the most succinct definition of neoliberalism, which is, quote, capitalism that has effectively eliminated working class opposition. And when you look at the actions of the Biden administration and the Democratic Party's majorities in both chambers of Congress, you see that, in a sense, neoliberalism is alive and well. Now, much ink was spilled in the early days of the Biden administration, comparing him to FDR, declaring that the era of austerity was over and that a transformational presidency was upon us. This was all due to the surprisingly large size of the COVID relief bill signed in March. It was a $1.9 trillion injection of cash into the economy without the usual deficit fear-mongering and appeals to bipartisanship. And while it's true that the COVID relief bill was much larger than Obama's pathetic little stimulus in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the question becomes, why? Why is it that Biden was so much bolder in this one instance than his former boss? Well, we on the left are understandably tempted to take at least some of the credit for that. The twin Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns did turn millions of people in America onto socialism, and there is a plethora of independent left media, like this very program, that engages with people in a totally different way, and that may have had some effect. But in a very persuasive piece for Labor Notes that asks, quote, who holds the power in Joe Biden's White House? Neil Meyer writes that, quote, the Biden stimulus bill was a big shift from Barack Obama's stingy response to the 2008 crisis and Donald Trump's tax cut orgy. But the question for working people is not where Biden's heart is at. It's this: who holds the power in his administration? The answer to that question will determine the opportunities and limits for reform in the next 4 years. So far, every indication we have suggests that business is still calling the shots in Washington, D.C. He continues, quote, as soon as Biden was elected, the business world quickly closed ranks behind the administration and demanded a new and massive stimulus package. Michelle Gass, CEO of Kohl's, put the matter bluntly in explaining her support and the support of other major retailers for a new stimulus package targeted at regular people. Anything that puts money into the pockets of our consumers is a good thing. In early February, Biden organized a meeting of corporate leaders to discuss the stimulus package. Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase, Doug McMillon of Walmart, Tom Donahue from the Chamber of Commerce, and Marvin Ellison from Lowe's were amongst the CEOs courted. Business rejoiced in its newfound closeness to the White House. Josh Bolton, CEO of the Business Roundtable, gushed about the administration. The communication with the business community is good, and the tone is good. Mike Summers of the American Petroleum Institute, friend of the show, noted, my CEOs have been pleasantly surprised at the level of engagement that the industry has received so far. And when the stimulus bill passed in March, business rejoiced. The aforementioned Business Roundtable put out a poll of CEOs that was positively orgasmic.
Just heard Wolfgang Puck talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, and you're sensing a similar optimism now from CEOs in this Business Roundtable CEO Economic Survey just out right now. Take a look at some of these numbers and you get a sense of what I'm talking about. Start with plans for hiring. That's up 30 points from the fourth quarter of 2020. Plans for capital investment also up 16 points from the fourth quarter of 2020. Sales expectations up 17 points from the fourth quarter of 2020. GDP growth, the estimate here is 3.7% now among these CEOs surveyed by the Business Roundtable. That's also up from where they were in terms of their prediction at the end of last year. And then here's a mind-boggling number. 72% of the CEOs surveyed here say that conditions have already recovered for their company by the end of 2021. So that is, they're saying that they are out of the woods or close to it at this point. 71% of the CEOs responding to that with that affirmation, really, of where the economy is going here. So all that coming, David, as we get this massive injection of new relief into the economy from Washington. So some cause for optimism here among the CEOs, David.
Now, don't get me wrong, the COVID relief bill was a pretty good bill by the standards of Washington. It was also supported overwhelmingly by the public. So business was on board, the public was on board. That usually means that a bill sails through. This is right around the time that you began to see the comparisons with FDR. NPR wrote, can Joe Biden join FDR and LBJ in the Democratic Party's pantheon? David Gergen, the dean of Washington's conventional wisdom, wrote a piece for CNN titled, The Three Striking Similarities Between FDR and Biden. And then The Economist wrote, Joe Biden was a boring candidate, he now draws comparisons to FDR. But there was one major difference between Joe Biden and FDR, one that was not noted in any of these pieces, and that is the organized political power of the working class. Remember, if neoliberalism is capitalism without working class opposition, well, in the 1930s, you saw the exact opposite. There was a crisis of capitalism that was met by a large, organized, and militant working class with powerful labor unions, not just here in the United States, but throughout the developed world, exerting pressure on capital through strikes and even the threat of revolution. And that is what gave us the New Deal, not just FDR's personal political talent and fondness for the working man. So, as the spring wore on, business began to put the squeeze on Biden's so-called transformational agenda. And that's because Biden's next legislative priority was a massive infrastructure bill. But the difference this time is that Biden planned to fund it through a modest increase in the corporate tax rate. And business did not like that. No. Here's what the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had to say.
So you're applauding the infrastructure package and the investment in our nation's infrastructure, but not the corporate tax act. So how should this be paid for? Deficit financed?
But that's exactly the right question, and the one that we need government officials to come together and solve, right? There are lots of ways to pay for this over time, the way we do a lot of investments. There are bonds, there are user fees, there's extending out the time we use to get that return. But this is the hard work of governing, and it's the right thing to do, not raise taxes at just the time that businesses are getting back on their feet and we're ready to have an economic recovery.
Can't raise taxes. So after businesses' united opposition to the tax increases, Meyer writes in Labor Notes, the administration immediately began to cave. Right after announcing the plans, Biden officials responded to corporate pushback by insisting that they were open to scaling back their ambitions. Brian Deese from Biden's National Economic Council told Fox News Sunday, quote, if people think this is too aggressive, then we'd like to hear what their plans are. It's something we want to have a conversation about. By people, Deese presumably meant corporate leaders. Speaking to more than 50 CEOs from Google, AT&T, Dell, Ford, Intel, and other companies, Biden's Secretary of Commerce said of negotiations with the corporate world, I've been encouraged. Nobody likes to talk about the pay-fors, but there is room for compromise. It seems now that Biden and his team have reached that compromise. The White House dramatically scaled back its ambitions in order to get a package that even some Republicans could support. A corporate tax hike is nowhere to be found in that proposal. But business does, in general, like improved infrastructure. They need decent roads to transport their goods and so on. But they certainly don't want to pay for it through taxes. So how do they want to fund it? Well, they like to call something they like to call user fees.
There's been some talk of flexibility on that corporate tax rate, going maybe not all the way up to 28 to 25, some leniency on the multinational part of it. Would any higher rate be acceptable according to the business group, or just no?
I think what's going to be important is figuring out what the best policy is, how to get our crumbling infrastructure to a more competitive place, prioritize those investments, and figure out how to pay for it. I think there are ways that we can come to the table and negotiate, but only if that's done in a bipartisan way and with business at the table.
Which is the best tax to increase as we sit here today, Suzanne?
I don't know that we ever think there's a best tax to increase at the U.S. Chamber, but I do think that in this case, it's probably more fair to think about user fees and gas taxes so that people who are actually advantaged by the investment of the infrastructure help pay for it over time.
I love those anchors questions. Like, is there any tax that you'd like, or just no? Well, of course, user fees and gas taxes are just a way to pass the cost away from businesses and on to regular people. But it wasn't just the Chamber of Commerce. That sentiment was echoed also by the CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers.
You've been pretty supportive of a lot of the president's initiatives in this first 75 days, but this idea of a higher corporate tax rate really did seem to be a bridge too far. Why?
Well, interesting way to say that, a bridge too far, when we're talking about infrastructure, Carl. Look, we very much are supportive. We're very supportive of the president's call for a bold investment in infrastructure. That is absolutely necessary. It has been decades, generations even, since this country has invested in it. So he's right on target there. The proposed way to pay for that, raising the corporate tax or raising taxes on businesses, it's a job killer. plain and simple. And so we want to work with Congress to come up with other ways to finance the president's proposal. As soon as the Congress figures out exactly what they want to spend money on, we have some proposals in our Building to Win proposal at the NAM that focuses on user fees and bonding and public-private partnerships. And there's all kinds of ways we can pay for infrastructure. We've been talking about this, again, for generations. So we really need to get this done and done right in a way that doesn't kill American jobs and manufacturing jobs.
So business doesn't want to increase the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. Remember, this would still be below the Obama era rate of 35%. Instead, they want user fees. So what does the Biden administration do? Well, they scrap the corporate tax increase and introduce, you guessed it, user fees. This is from Yahoo News. Quote, the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure accord would institute a multi-year national motor vehicle per mile user fee pilot program that, without future intervention from the White House, could potentially violate one of Joe Biden's previously stated red lines. Top White House officials emphatically stated for months that paying for the infrastructure investments by indexing gas taxes to inflation or instituting new electric vehicle mileage fees were hard red lines for the president on the grounds that they would raise taxes on people earning less than $400,000 per year. Yet, the new per mile user fee pilot outlined in Section 13002 of the bill does leave those people open to tax vulnerabilities pegged to personal vehicle mileage. And this dynamic plays out again and again and again with issue after issue. On the campaign trail, for example, Democrats made a lot of noise about the student debt crisis in this country. They could easily scrap most of it, if not all of it, with the stroke of a pen if they wanted to, but they're not going to do that. And now Nancy Pelosi has come out flat out against it. Ryan Grimm and Ken Klippenstein have the goods over at The Intercept. They write, quote, the drive to persuade President Joe Biden to cancel student debt took a major hit last week when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi stunned Congress with a surprise statement in opposition. The move may put her at odds with much of the public and the Democratic Party, but it aligns her with Democratic megadonors Stephen and Mary Swig, the billionaire scions of the Bay Area's oldest real estate dynasty, who have deep ties to the California representative. Stephen Swig has also long served as a treasurer for Pelosi in her fundraising efforts. In November, after Biden's election and amid increased pressure to cancel student debt, the Swigs quietly circulated a memo among key Capitol Hill figures, making the dubious case that debt cancellation at the executive level is illegal. The argument in the memo gets much of its weight by virtue of the wealthy couple who produced it, as the Swigs are not just major funders of progressive nonprofits, but also have the significantly bankrolled Pelosi and her House Democratic caucus. On the issue of unemployment insurance, Democrats have signaled that they will allow most of it to expire in September. According to a study, as many as 7.5 million people will lose their unemployment benefits on, of all days, Labor Day. But there has been no talk about extending the unemployment benefits further. It really looks like the Biden administration has decided that COVID relief is just done in September, and that's that. It sounds like they've been listening to the complaints of restaurant owners who claim that they cannot find workers because of the dreaded unemployment insurance. And the New York Times podcast, The Daily, spoke to some of these restaurant owners, and here's what they had to say.
Where do you think everyone went? What do you think is happening?
Everyone is getting free money sitting at home. That's all the reason is. It's very clear.
The government is just giving out so much help. You know, they're basically making more money to stay home.
If I was getting $600 a week, I would not be going to work either. I would be chilling out with my money.
This unemployment, it makes people more lazy. People rather stay home and watching TV than go back to work.
In a world of capital and labor, capital has the upper hand, perhaps more than ever before. But working class opposition to capital can have tangible effects. Let's take the eviction moratorium as a case in point. Real estate interests desperately want to end the eviction moratorium.
But the National Apartment Association called out eviction moratoriums, tweeting, the idea that we want people to lose their housing is simply untrue. This is an industry of people and homes, not empty buildings. Adding, the eviction moratorium is an unfunded government mandate that forces housing providers to deliver a costly service without compensation and saddles renters with an insurmountable debt.
And Li Fang at The Intercept writes, quote, "The real estate industry has been vocally opposed to the CDC's moratorium. Lobbying records show real estate groups spent millions of dollars over the last year attempting to weaken or repeal eviction moratoriums and other landlord-related restrictions relating to the pandemic. Last December, the National Apartment Association, which you saw in that previous clip, a trade group representing landlords, joined a federal lawsuit seeking to overturn the eviction moratorium order. And last month, the National Apartment Association filed a new suit designed to recover economic losses incurred by the CDC's eviction moratorium." Lee looked at the earnings report for some of these real estate companies and listened to calls with investors. And they all spoke openly about how desperate they were to evict tenants. Last Thursday, UDR Inc., a real estate trust that owns 149 apartment complexes, also released its earnings reports showing dazzling growth. The company reported strong financials, including increased revenue and a 97.5% occupancy rate, a new high watermark. Alexander Kalmus, a senior associate with Zelman & Associates, during the call pressured UDR on the end of various restrictions on landlords. UDR executives quickly chimed in, explaining that the firm would move swiftly on evictions once the moratoriums are gone. "We have about 400 people that if we could evict today, we would," replied Michael Lacey, UDR Senior Vice President of Property Operations, during a general discussion of the company's second quarter earnings. So as the eviction moratorium was set to expire, Democrats in the White House and the leadership in Congress were doing essentially nothing. And Andrew Perez and Joel Warner at the Daily Poster reported that, quote, "House Democrats super PAC took in $1 million from the chairman of a massive apartment rental company in June before letting the federal eviction moratorium expire over the weekend amid a COVID-19 pandemic that continues to surge." So as the eviction moratorium was set to expire and millions were going to be sent on the street, there was a bit of opposition.
Comes amid increased pressure for another extension from the White House by people like our next guest, Congresswoman Cori Bush, who at one time in her life was homeless. She has spent the last few nights sleeping on the Capitol steps.
Now, Cori Bush's inspired bit of political theater was crucial in getting the administration to act and extend the moratorium through October. It's a tiny, tiny victory for what is already a half measure to begin with, but it was an example of how even a slight bit of working class opposition can have meaningful effects. Imagine if we had large, militant, powerful labor unions. So as we look at politics in the near future, we are always tempted to focus on the day-to-day fights and the personalities of individual politicians. What we cannot do is lose sight of the structural nature of all of this. Our only hope for a better world is to change the balance of power between capital and labor. Under capitalism, capital will always have a major advantage, but there have been moments where a more powerful and organized working class has been able to achieve real victories. And we also have to be clear-eyed about the Democratic Party. I want to go back to Neil Meyer's piece. He points out just how thoroughly business has gone over to the Democrats. He writes, quote, "A Yale poll of directors at America's largest companies found that 77% plan to vote for Joe Biden. CEOs also coupled their support for the Democratic Party with their wallets. Data suggests that CEOs from larger companies giving to Biden outnumbered those giving to Trump 2-1. Large donors as a whole accounted for 61% of Biden's war chest." This is coupled with the equally troubling trend of national security psychos like James Comey and Bill Kristol and various CIA spooks going full Democrat. And look how easily the Democratic Party establishment was able to shrug off Nina Turner's campaign. This is not to say that we should all become Republicans either. I find the arguments for a current realignment unpersuasive. What is clear is that the avenues to achieve progressive change through the electoral arena are incredibly muddled. Our focus has to be on organizing working class power. If that happens, the politics will sort themselves out.
Well, Nando, the good news is we're going to interview Vivek Chibber about organizing workers. That's the interview today. But man, that was such a great segment. And I have a lot to say, but I'll try to keep it brief. Let me just start off by addressing, it was a small part of your Decode segment, but it was the part that like literally filled me with rage because I had done a Decode segment on it earlier, and it's the user fees tied to mileage. So think about that, right? The corporations don't want any type of tax hike, even though during the pandemic, they were taken care of. Many of them are already doing pretty well. Yes, they're bitching and complaining about a labor shortage, but are unwilling to provide the working conditions and the pay necessary to bring workers back. But, you know, the whole thing about the user fees is we don't want to pay taxes. We want to implement a regressive tax that impacts everyone, regardless of what their income is, right? And so think about the people who end up driving the most to and from work. It's people who can't afford to live close to work in these urban areas, right? So they literally have to move an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours away from work and then commute back and forth. Okay. The housing prices obviously have a lot to do with this. And then they're going to be further punished with these user fees, which are based on mileage. I mean, it's incredibly infuriating. And I just wanted to share my thoughts on that. But, you know, going back to, go ahead.
No, yeah. Right on, girl.
It's just anyway. But anyway, just to focus on your overall thesis here, you're absolutely right. And what's incredible about the corporate interest capture of the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party is sick with this virus that's literally killing them, right? Not literally killing them, but like killing their chances at a future. It kills their candidacy in many cases. Yes, at this point, you can see a correlation between corporate money and the ability of a candidate to be able to win, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. But increasingly, the Democratic Party is losing support among working people. We know that. But more importantly, you have the Republican Party that is essentially rigging the electoral system further to their advantage through gerrymandering, through state laws that suppress the vote. And the only chance that Democrats have in fighting back against that is by passing a voting rights bill. I would, of course, prefer the For the People Act, which is a more robust piece of legislation that reforms elections and also addresses money in politics. Democrats have a self-preservation interest in passing that legislation, but corporate interests don't want it. And so and more importantly, in the Senate, Democrats would have to do away with the legislative filibuster in order to pass that legislation. They're unwilling to do away with the filibuster because corporate interests love the legislative filibuster. I mean, the Senate is where policy goes to die, and they know that. They love that. And so that's part of the reason why you have corporate Democrats like Manchin, Warner, Tester, Sinema talking about the importance of maintaining the legislative filibuster in the Senate. It's not about bipartisanship. It's 100% about blocking the legislation that their corporate donors do not want, even if it means that it's a political suicide for Democrats in the near future. It's amazing.
Yeah, listen, this is a newish trend. Newish meaning that started around the 1970s and has continued through today. The corporatization of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party. In the United States, there's always been two largely business parties. That's not new. But because of the presence of large labor unions that exerted meaningful political influence, the Democratic Party was a meaningful countervailing force to a Republican Party that was just, thoroughly the party of big business. And that's when the Democratic Party delivered those gains to people. But as, neoliberalism and, things like the Democratic Leadership Council in the 1980s, Bill Clinton, all these awful people, adopted a different pose for Democrats, abandoned labor unions, and sort of welcomed the Wall Street class, professional people, the educated suburbanites and things like that, which they actively court all the time. They love those voters. The effect is of a new type of politics in which there is this kind of professional party in which college educated people like ourselves, we're not going to vote Republican, right? We're just not going to do that.
Right.
That's just
of course.
And so it's the perfect scenario for them because there's this incredibly reactionary, revanchist, disgusting Republican Party that, unites the worst elements of society. And then this just other party that is kind of urbane and educated, but is also fully in bed with Wall Street and increasingly national security elements. And because they were so horrified by Trump, understandably. So our avenues are so bleak and so limited if we're focused on that arena. It doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge elections. We should, support Nina Turner. And, after reading Carb's piece, I got the feeling that should Nina run again in the next, whatever the next election is, in Congress, they're every 2 years. So it's, it's not like she has to wait 6 years for the Senate seat to open up or something. You get the sense that she might be able to pull it off, especially in a non kind of middle of the summer special election instead of like you got the sense that maybe she could pull it off. But yeah, it's just it's bleak. If this is what happens when your politics has no meaningful labor power, this is what happens. This is the effect. You have two parties that are completely unresponsive to any sort of real change, and the mechanisms that we have to exert pressure are so limited. This poor woman has to friggin' sleep on the Capitol steps just to get the smallest bit of relief for renters. I mean, that's what is required just to get the tiniest. I mean, it's so tiny.
I know. Yeah. But it's literally the only action you can get in a positive direction in a system that, again, is beholden to corporate donors, regardless of which party we're talking about. And look, you very briefly mentioned the personality stuff, like politics is now devolved into personality. That's what Peter Mayer wrote about, the late political scientist. Yeah, politics has become culture wars, cults of personality. And so on one hand, I can't begrudge people for sometimes wrongly like losing focus on what matters to try to decipher what's in a politician's heart. But you said it best. It actually doesn't matter. Right? Politics is all about incentives and disincentives. People are people. They're going to look out for their own self-preservation and for their own interests. And the question is, who has more sway, or which group has more sway over these parties and over these specific candidates? And with no labor power or weak labor power, corporate interests are always going to have more sway. And, when you look at what the intended role of government really is under neoliberalism, it's not that government doesn't have a role. It's just that government is meant to interfere on behalf of corporate interests, not on behalf of workers or the American people.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this clip from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode or catch any future live stream by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thank you.